George, a chef of many years' experience, was a kind of barometer for his restaurant. He was used to the rhythm of the kitchen, to the constant flurry of people, and seemed to be able to read each of his employees like an open book. Years of work had taught him to recognize falsity, to notice subtle changes in mood and behavior. He saw how the cooks were nervous before an important order, how the waiters flirted with customers, how the dishwashers were tired at the end of the shift. This daily routine, this human maelstrom, was his familiar world. But in the midst of it all, it was Isabel who caught George's eye. She worked as a dishwasher, and lately he had noticed something disturbing, uncharacteristic about her. Her movements had become hurried, her eyes restless. It was as if she didn't want to linger after work, but at the same time she was in no hurry to leave, as if something or someone was holding her back. George couldn't help but notice her frequent glances toward the door, her indecision. He became curious. It was more than professional interest. There was something about her behavior that was unsettling, as if a grain of sand had gotten into the smooth running of his restaurant, disrupting the usual course of events. It was unusual, and there was a mystery in it that made him ask questions that he hadn't yet found the answers to. Watching Isabel, George could feel the uneasiness building up inside. Her movements, usually confident and quick, had become fidgety, as if she were trying to hide something. The restlessness in her eyes, those nervous glances at the door, it all told him that something was wrong. He, used to the measured rhythm of his restaurant, couldn't just ignore these changes. His intuition, honed by years of working with people, told him that there was something more behind this outward anxiety. When Isabel once again stopped at the exit, hesitant to leave, his suspicions grew stronger. The decision came somehow on its own, without much thought. "Isabel, just a minute," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, though his insides were churning. She turned around and George saw the unconcealed fear in her eyes. "Would you mind showing me what you have in your bag?" The question sounded unexpected even to himself. Isabel seemed to freeze in place, as if trapped. She hesitated, and this hesitation only increased his suspicions. She knew she could not refuse, but there was horror in her eyes, a desperate desire to hide the truth. Slowly, with trembling hands, she opened the bag. George expected to see anything: stolen food, drinks, maybe some change. But what he saw shocked him. There was none of what he had expected. He saw letters, some documents, papers that clearly had nothing to do with working at the restaurant. As he delved into their contents, it gradually dawned on him what he was up against. They were evidence of her desperate struggle, her attempts to protect her young daughter from threats. Her past, which she had tried so hard to hide, had come out. It wasn't a theft, it was a fight for survival. In that moment, George's suspicions were replaced with deep sympathy. He saw not a thief, but a desperate mother willing to do anything for her child. But there were other facets to this story that had yet to be realized. Isabel seemed to carry a weight on her shoulders that was visible even through her restraint. Behind those anxious glances, behind that hurried movement, hid a whole universe of struggle. In the depths of her bag, among the crumpled papers and old letters, lay not just a collection of personal belongings, but a cry for help encoded in desperate lines. Each letter was a testament to her tireless efforts to protect her young daughter from the shadows of her past, from the man who should have been her pillar of strength but had become her worst nightmare. Her ex-husband, a drug dealer, had made their life a constant worry, and Isabel had done everything she could to shield her child from his influence. She didn't steal. She was gathering evidence to keep her daughter safe, to keep her from the darkness that had once consumed her own life. It wasn't just documents. It was her pain, her fear, her motherly love elevated to an absolute. Every day she faced a threat. Every day she fought for her child's future. And every day her heart broke at the realization of her vulnerability. She wasn't a criminal. She was a mother willing to do anything to protect the most precious thing she had. Isabel seemed to carry an invisible armor of despair and hope, and that armor was cracking under the weight of her burden. The sight of those letters, that evidence of her desperate struggle, was like a blow under the breath that rendered George speechless. He was used to predictability, to the simplicity of human behavior. But here he was confronted with the dark side of life, the reality where survival becomes the ultimate goal. And this encounter with such blatant vulnerability changed his perception of everything he had taken for granted up to that point. He saw not just a dishwasher, but a woman who carried the entire world on her shoulders, and that world was filled with pain, fear, and endless love. Now that the truth was out, the question of what to do next remained open. For behind this desperate act lay not only Isabel's tragedy, but also the difficult moral choice he had to make. George stood petrified, clutching the letters in his hand, the evidence of the desperate struggle for the little girl's life. It was not just a story of rule-breaking, but an abyss of human pain and fear. The familiar world, where everything was clear and understandable, where each employee had his place and his function, suddenly fell apart, revealing the true reality, cruel and unpredictable. He, accustomed to judging people by their actions within the confines of his restaurant, found himself helpless before such a revelation. This was no longer an issue of theft or labor misconduct. It was a clash with desperation, with a mother's love, willing to do anything to protect her child. George felt some strange dissonance building up inside him. On the one hand, he realized that he had to do something, that he couldn't just turn a blind eye to what he had seen. On the other hand, he was frightened by the very thought of interfering in someone else's life, in this tangled story where his usual rules and principles were powerless. For the first time in a long time, George felt that he was not a chief, not a strict manager, but only a man standing in the face of someone else's tragedy. He was used to order, to predictability, to the fact that every day in his restaurant was similar to the previous one. Now he realized that the world was far more complex and chaotic than he had thought. Isabel, the quiet and inconspicuous dishwasher, had suddenly become a heroine, a symbol of struggle and resilience, and he, George, had to decide what role to play in her story. There was a real battle going on inside him. One part of him, brought up on rules and discipline, told him, "Don't get involved. It's none of your business. You have your own worries." The other, more human and compassionate, cried out, "You can't just turn away. You have to help this woman. You have to do something." He didn't understand how this could have happened, how a routine bag check had led him to realize such a profound human drama, and why he was the one who had to witness it. He felt awkward, insecure, as if he had fallen into a trap he had set for himself. His self-confidence, his ability to make clear and quick decisions, had suddenly vanished. He was facing not just a problem, but a moral dilemma that required not so much professionalism as humanity and understanding. He realized that his decision would affect not only Isabel's life, but also his own. And it was this realization that made him hesitate, doubt, and search for the answer in the depths of his soul. His choice would be the starting point, but what would be its impact? And so in the silence of the kitchen commotion, as the sounds of pans and cooks' voices faded, George found himself alone with his shock. He looked at these letters, these scraps of hope and despair, and something changed in him. The familiar world, where everything was clear and understandable, where each employee was just a cog in the mechanism of the restaurant, suddenly blurred, giving way to something deeper and more complex. He, always confident in his discernment, suddenly felt blind. How could he have failed to notice that behind this quiet and modest woman lurked such a storm? How could he, with his years of experience, judge people so superficially? George stood staring at the documents for a long time, as if trying to read between the lines, not just the words, but the pain they carried. He saw not a dishwasher who had broken the rules, but a mother desperately fighting for her child. And that vision, that realization, was stronger than any rules and regulations. He could have just closed his eyes, pretended nothing had happened, could have let Isabel go, and everything would have gone back to normal. But now that he'd seen the truth, now that he'd felt her desperate struggle, he couldn't stay away anymore. A quiet revolution was taking place within him. For years he had lived by the rules, by established norms, and it made his life predictable and understandable. But now, in this moment, he was realizing that there are things that are more important than order and discipline. There is humanity, compassion, a willingness to reach out to someone in need. And he felt that feeling, the desire to help, the desire to protect, sprouting in his soul, displacing his usual skepticism and calculating nature. George no longer saw Isabel as an intruder. He saw her as strong, courageous, loving, capable of doing anything for her child. And he knew he couldn't let her fight alone. He had to stand beside her, be her ally, her support. It wasn't just an act of mercy, it was his own choice. His way of saying that he too was capable of deep feelings, that he too could go beyond his usual role. He didn't know what difficulties lay ahead of them. He didn't know how this struggle would end. But he knew one thing: he would not abandon Isabel. He would help her, he would support her, he would be there for her until she found peace. And in that decision, in that willingness to share her burden, he found more than just the satisfaction of a decision well made. He found meaning, a new purpose, a new facet of his own humanity. This was not the end of the story, but rather its beginning. The beginning of a journey where two people, united by a common struggle and human kindness, walked towards an unknown but hopeful future. In this story, there was not only despair and pain, but also something that gave strength to move on, something that made you believe in the possibility of overcoming any difficulties. And this aspect, this hope, opened new horizons.